associating eugenic thought with the Nazi movement and the Holocaust, destroyed the cultural viability of biological thinking about human behavior, essentially from the 1930s to the 1960s. This is what Alan V. Horowitz writes. So during the 1930s to the 60s, organic genetic explanations largely dropped out of the intellectual landscape for accounting for how should we then live. And there was this one other point I wanted to make about this philosophy of how should we then live. So it's a worthy question, and I'm certainly interested in it. But there's another question which is equally important, frequently more important than how should we then live, and that is the question, how do we live? How do people operate? It's great to talk about how people should live and should operate and should behave and should speak, but first you have to start with, how do people actually work? Like, what are the facts on the ground? What's the reality of human nature? Like, how much are we genetically predisposed? How much does environment affect us? Like, how do people tend to react to cues and to stimuli? So first we have to understand reality before we can make any substantial difference with trying to adapt or shape reality in a more pleasing direction. It's akin to, let's say you've got a roommate who's an alcoholic, right? And you want to be helpful to your alcoholic roommate. So all your direct efforts to wean him away from alcoholism and get him recovery are only going to backfire. There's nothing you can do to prod him towards recovery that is assertive on your end. You can't say, hey, take a look at this. But one thing you can do is to look at yourself and ask yourself, why am I interested in putting so much energy into helping someone who has no desire to help himself? Why am I so invested in his recovery? Why don't I get invested in my recovery? And how am I being served by being obsessed with someone else's recovery rather than being obsessed with my own recovery? Now, we can't control other people, and we can't always even control ourselves, but we do have some influence over us, and we do have some influence over other people. So the better choices we make will tend to have a positive influence over other people. We also have the opportunity to extend empathy to others. So if someone's got a hangover, demonstrating some amount of empathy, may go a long way. If someone's having trouble, extending some empathy to someone you're living with is going to help out. But trying to give someone directions, trying to tell someone what to do, that usually doesn't work out very well. So we tend to get into these relationships where the more conscientious we become and the more we try to look after the other person, then the more irresponsible they become. Or the more sloppy we become, the more conscientious they become. Because there's something about relationships that likes homeostasis, likes things staying the same. That's why it's so hard to change dynamics in a family. So when you become harder working, someone else will start slacking off. When you become more conscientious, someone else will become more sloppy. Because we have this inherent innate desire to keep things just the way they are. So in the 19th century, we had the rise of the social sciences. We didn't have the social sciences prior to the 19th century. And the social sciences looked at society as the primary prism through which they viewed their academic discipline. And so sociologists, anthropologists, economists, psychologists, they all promoted extreme environmental approaches. They, generally speaking, ignore genetic explanations. So all the social sciences have had a long history of minimizing biological influences on behavior. So how then should we live from the social science perspective is always like, how do we rejigger incentives within society to show people better ways of living? And why do people act the way they do? From the social science perspective, it was always to look at society. That was the unit that was analyzed in the social sciences. And there was a great minimizing of biological and genetic factors. So from the social science perspective, human nature is just infinitely malleable and simply responds to different cultural conditions. But then in the 1970s, we had this major counter-reaction against this social and cultural emphasis. So the organic biological outlook that dominated the 19th century slowly returned to prominence beginning in the 1970s, and the landmark book is E.O. Wilson's Time Sociobiology. So he synthesized scholarship on how genes determine most animal behaviors, and then he concludes with a controversial chapter on how human behaviors also have natural genetic underpinnings. So Wilson claimed that all phenomena, from the birth of stars, the working out of social institutions are based on material processes that are governed by the laws of physics. And so there are similar-minded works from authors like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Steven Pinker, and they have led the biologically based views of human nature back to cultural respectability. And so the field of psychology has sharply reacted against behaviorism, which says the environment and culture is everything, and turned once again towards the study of cognitive and brain processes such as neuroscience. What's my take on evolutionary psychology? I find it absolutely fascinating, but I'm not like bowing down to it and say this is the answer. All right, evolutionary psychology is also affected by culture, so I'm not saying that the culture and society makes no difference. So genes play a role, culture plays a role. When you are having issues, take interest in other people's problems and your problems melt away. Yes, that's true. So if you feel no empathy for others, you are not seeing the world accurately. As soon as you start seeing the world accurately, as soon as you start seeing other people accurately, as soon as you start recognizing the humanity in other people, you can't help but feel varying degrees of empathy. So if you're not feeling empathy for people, then you're not seeing them accurately. You have a distorted view of reality.